Thing you read on the internet today, except believe your eyes. We have comic legend Brett R. Smith coming on the show today, and here he is. But first, Dornall, how was your week?
Hey man, week was good. It went by too quickly, let me tell you. I don't really have anything crazy or interesting to report, but I did go see the latest John Wick. You knew I had to.
Hmm.
That was really exciting. Have you guys seen it yet?
Not yet.
All right.
Nor
Well,
am I.
all right. We'll do a full review on the show next week. So, uh, uh, oh, I forgot to ask, Mr. Smith. Should I call you Brett or Mr. R.
Yeah,
Smith or?
Bryce was fine. Yeah.
So Brett, now we're about to make a fan of the show out of you. So listen in next week when we talk about John Wick. We can all compare notes over the great internet.
Yeah, the demographics were interesting on that. My buddy Larry Schweikert, who wrote Patriots History of the United States, went and saw it, and he loved it. But apparently he told me that like it pulled in like 70% male audience. So it was probably that, and Top Gun Maverick, was able to pull men back into the movie theater, which isn't kind of a feat these days.
Sure is. It really is.
You know.
Need some red meat, some red blooded action flicks.
Well, yeah, and something other than a female protagonist. I mean,
Yep.
what a novel idea.
And in the same year, we also had Maverick. I mean, what the heck is up with that? I mean, within a year, not the same year, but still.
It was something else I talked about with Chuck. On the on Political Punks, which which I know you watch. We were talking about how Yellowstone is so popular, and when Hollywood wants to make money, they always go back to traditional values. And I think that also, if you want to get guys back in the movie theater, give them action and give them a male protagonist. And of course, we all grew up with Keanu, so it's kind of like the old gunslingers, Tom Cruise and Keanu. These guys are sort of like the last action heroes in a lot of ways, and I think that it's not only nostalgia and also just who we're familiar with, but these guys are talented, and I think they also understand what works and what's always worked. Hollywood just loves to deviate from that, or they seem to. That seems to be the pattern, but they've been throwing so much bad, good money at bad entertainment that, on top of COVID, which basically shut the entire industry down. I think it's finally catching up to them, and they've got to go back to traditional American values, and they've got to go back to what works rather than sort of, throwing shit up against a wall, throwing woke shit up against a wall to see what would stick. So
Yeah.
it's
Good
really
luck.
positive. I mean, those are two positive movies that, you know, had they occurred in the 80s or the 90s, the studios would say, okay, we need to follow that method because we want to make money too. You know, you can look at the buddy cop genre. If you look at Lethal Weapon or, I mean, or Die Hard. How often there's like the old joke. Die Hard on a plane, Die Hard on a bus, Die Hard in a submarine. It's like that used to be the way Hollywood thought was let's take this template which works really well and plug different actors into it and see if it'll work. And 9 times out of 10, I mean, or probably more, it did work. And that's what people want to see. So,
So, do you think this is just a temporary panic thing, or do you think they're actually going to be making some permanent changes?
God, it's tough. I mean, the people that run Hollywood are not the same people that ran Hollywood in the 70s or the 80s or maybe even the 90s. So I don't know. It's a tough one. They lampooned Tom and they made fun of Tom, Jimmy Kimmel, and others, and like really made fun of him, not just kind of like playfully poking fun at him, but going after him over the Scientology and certain things. And I think that that's a troubling sign because I think that what a lot of Hollywood, I think Hollywood looks at Tom and they say, why isn't he repeating all this woke SJW crap? Why isn't he with us? Why isn't he fighting for the cause that we're all fighting for? And why is he trying to shoehorn all of this crap into his movies? and that's troubling to me because they know it doesn't work, and then they look at Tom and they see what he does, whether it's Mission Impossible or whether it's Maverick, and it does work, and it makes a lot of money, and people love to go to those films not only once but twice. I saw Top Gun Maverick twice in the theater. I don't know when the last time that I went and saw a movie twice in the theater. I honestly, in the 80s and the 90s, I used to see movies 2, 3 times. I remember I saw Batman Begins like 5 times in the theater because I loved it so much, and it's still my favorite of the three from the standpoint of the Nolan verse. But we don't have movie stars like that anymore.
No,
You know?
it's been said
So-
many times that Tom Cruise is the last movie star.
Yeah, and I think Keanu's kind of there, but sort of obviously sort of not at that, not the same caliber, because Keanu's been sort of different things to us over the years. Whether it's River's End, or whether it's Bill and Ted, or whether it's John Wick, or I mean, really, to me, Keanu didn't really become an action hero until The Matrix, and that's sort of what Speed, or Point Break, obviously, but really an action star, somebody who you kind of just looked at. But he's making movies with Scorsese, and he was he had a pretty diverse career, pretty diverse background in movie making, and he wasn't just sort of pigeonholed into action hero like Bruce or like Stallone or like Arnold. So I think Keanu is a legit action star now, but it kind of came late for him. Whereas Tom's always sort of been kind of that guy, even though he's got a pretty diverse background too, with working with Oliver Stone and Stanley Kubrick, and I mean, granted, not everybody can be Tom Cruise. I mean that is he's one of a kind. So, but we're blessed to have him, and I know people like to rag on the Scientology stuff, but um, that stuff just doesn't bother me, and ever since that Matt Lauer interview, he doesn't talk about anything other than pop culture, entertainment, and seems to like reminding everyone how grateful he is for the life that we've all afforded him. So, and you don't see movie stars going out there and doing that. I mean, it's one thing to hang out of an airplane and say, "Thank you for letting me entertain you," but movie stars don't do that even when they're in junkets, or even at award ceremonies. They're just stroking themselves and stroking everybody else.
Hmm.
And Tom Cruise has he doesn't just have charisma, and he doesn't just have he has good cinematic instincts. And I saw this story last night. It was for one of the Mission Impossible movies. They sent the movie to test audiences, and it kept coming back that they felt like there were 5 endings. And so the studio was really upset, and they were like, okay, we need to do some reshoots. We need to completely replumb this. And Tom Cruise came back and said, look, the problem is that after the end of every one of these action sequences, we give this big musical sting. And so it feels like the movie is over for 5 times. What we need to do is we need to give, and this was in the temporary musical score, what we need to do is we need to have one piece of music for this entire 20 minutes that makes it feel like it's one linked action scene. And so if we have this 1 20-minute musical score, that'll do it. And they went back, they scored that entire 20 minutes as one musical score. They sent it to the audience, all the notes stopped. That's it. That fixed the movie. So it's not just his acting, and it's not just his charisma, and it's not just his smile and him running. He genuinely has good movie making instincts, and he genuinely brings stuff to the table.
Yeah, I mean, he's a producer, and he's a very successful producer. So, and you just look at all the people he's worked with. Look at all the talent, the directors he's worked with. Tony Scott, Oliver Stone, I mean, Kubrick, on and on and on. The guy's worked with the best of the best, and he loves movies. He loves cinema so much. He's one of those guys that is a sponge, and he's going to sit there and he's going to learn and he's going to apply what he's learned over the years, like any good artist, any successful one. And I just think that that's a great example of somebody who knows how to make movies and knows how to I mean, think about that. Think about the money they would have spent to go back and do reshoots. That's insane. And
Yeah.
all you've got to do is just go and tweak the score. I mean, that's the kind of understanding of aesthetics and just basic movie making that I think is indicative of great directors. And yet he's never directed anything. He chooses to be the star, but also be a producer, so he has a hand in things. I think probably the Mummy might have been, probably maybe the weakest link, but and I never saw that. It doesn't do anything for me. I wasn't really interested in seeing it. Maybe I should, because maybe it's worth seeing something that failed, that or sort of failed, that he did is not quite as strong as the rest of his work. But Tom's career's got peaks and valleys, but it seems like he's really zeroed in on what he does the best, and that's what he chooses to focus on. And I think as artists, it's like Clint says, a man's got to know his limitations, and that kind of goes across all life. But as an artist, I think you got to know your limitations and know your strengths and your weaknesses. And when I produce graphic novels, that's certainly been the case. I know what my strengths and my weaknesses are, so I try and build my creative teams, as strong as I can to, cover my weaknesses, and therefore, give other artists an opportunity to shine where I could never, write as well as Chuck Dixon or draw like Paul Revauche. That's not my forte, but I can take their work and I can make it even better. I can plus it, which is what ultimately the comic book, that's the assembly line of what the comic book making process is all about. Is similar to animation, where you know the further you get down the line, each creative is, as Walt Disney used to say, is plussing the work that they're given. So those sketches that go to the background painters plus them. They make them even better. And I just think that that's sort of what you try to do when you're creating an art and entertainment. Is you're always trying to take what you're given and make it even better with your own abilities. And part of that is knowing your limitations. It's kind of like, I don't do my own taxes. I know my limitations. But I have a great CPA, and I give her as much information as possible so she can go and, help me out. But I think Tom understands his limitations. He knows what he's best at, which is why. And it's strange to think that he's never directed anything. I mean, every actor seems to want to get behind the camera. That just seems to be, and I think a lot of that is hubris. But Tom is more comfortable being in front of it and being a producer. And really, I mean, you can have a lot of say as a producer, that's for sure, because you're kicking in the cash for it. So, but that's really interesting about Mission Impossible. I can't wait to see that. It looks amazing, and I love the last one. So I was kind of bummed that Henry had to eat it at the end because he was so good. He was amazing.
He has the Mission Impossible series has just been just an amazingly consistent, great series of action films.
Some stronger than others, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're all above baseline, really good. And look at the directors and the writers attached to all of them. I mean, they're all top tier talents.
And even number 3 gets a lot of flack, but number 3, if you go watch it without thinking about the scandals that were going on at the time, is actually a really good movie.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my hobby horse. I always pimp out number 3 when it comes up in conversation.
I think the last one was my favorite. I mean, I just thought that it was so good, and the ensemble cast was. I think I love the first one a lot. I remember seeing that in the theater, and just being blown away. It was isn't that Wolfgang Peterson that did the first one? I think I forget.
No, but it was De Palma.
De Palma, thank you. Yeah,
I mean, De Palma.
Maybe the most un-De Palma movie ever. You know, because when I think of De Palma, I think of Goodfellas, and I think of Blowout, and I think of sort of the early work, which sort of got him, Pauline Kael, and everyone sort of, basically sort of saying that he's sort of what do they call those guys? The brutalists. He and Paul Schrader and Milius and all those guys from back then. They all thought that they were just sort of these ultra macho men who went out and made these super ultra violent movies, and of course they were so much more than that. You know, and all this violence was gratuitous and unnecessary, whereas no, it all had plot points, and it made sense. It was all justified within the story. It wasn't just violence for violence sake. So, and that's one of the problems I have with Tarantino, is sometimes I just think that he does wade into violence for violence sake, and I get kind of turned off, even though Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think is I just think it's a brilliant, perfect film. I just adore that movie. I never figured he could make a movie that was better than Jackie Brown, but he did, and it's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
And
My
that's
favorite
another
by far.
Yeah,
that's another unfortunately overlooked movie is Jackie Brown.
God, it's just so brilliant. It's so good, and really, you know, is that Elmore Leonard? Is that who that is? Or is it? Yeah. I always get him mixed up with who's the guy that did LA Confidential? Who wrote that? James Ellroy. For some reason, I always get them mixed up. But I've read some Elmore Leonard. After Justified, I went and I bought Writing the Rap and what's the other book? I forget, which is all based around Rayland, because they're just short stories. There's never been a full book about Rayland. They're just short stories. And Fire in the Hole. But amazing writer, just incredible writer, who passed away, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. But Quentin stuck to the book. He stuck to the source material, but I think that, like I was talking about, he plussed it, by bringing in all this talent, this huge ensemble cast, and obviously Quentin's such a cinephile. He's such a lover of movies and visual storytelling. It was the perfect marriage. In a lot of ways, the same way that True Romance is a perfect marriage between Quentin's script and the late great, excuse me, Tony Scott, who's probably one of my favorite directors, next to his brother Ridley. So Ridley's probably in my top 5. So, but even Quentin said, I could have never made that movie, not the way Tony did, and the way Tony did it was perfect. It was just absolutely perfect. I watched that again for, the umpteenth time, because it's free on Pluto TV right now. And it's just amazing how good everyone is. Even Brian Rappaport, who's such a punk in real life. Dick Ritchie, it's just, he's hilarious. I mean, he's just absolutely hilarious. Everybody's so funny in that movie. Brad Pitt, James Gandolfini. It's just a 10. It's just an absolute 10. And it's almost kind of like what Tony did for True Romance is sort of like what Quentin did for Rum Punch, which was obviously the book, and then Jackie Brown. So
I think Michael Madsen got my favorite line in that movie. When he's listening in on all the interactions going on, he says, I'm really starting to like this guy.
I love this kid. Yeah, it's so great. Man, yeah, there's so those guys have was it Michael Madsen or was that Tom Sizemore?
I get those two.
It's Tom Sizemore.
Tom Sizemore. Okay.
Yeah, he's another one he's just one of these great character actors that can take these small parts and and steal scenes, and Madsen is, God, another one. It's just a genius, just so good. I remember the first time I realized that that's Virginia's brother. I was just like, what? Because she was a very early crush for me growing up. There's this kind of
Oh, she's.
small movie that she did with Craig Schaefer called Fire with Fire. It's ran
I've
on.
seen that.
Craig Schaefer like goes to some boys camp or something, and they have some kind of forbidden love affair, and it's I don't want to sit here and say it's like a great movie because I don't think it's very good, but good performances from those two. And it's one of those movies which ran pretty heavily in rotation on cable TV in the 80s that I probably shouldn't have been watching, but was able to watch.
I saw it on HBO. Is where I saw it.
That's probably where I saw it too, because back then you had HBO, you had the movie channel, Showtime, and then probably towards the mid to late 80s, we ended up with Cinemax, which is where I saw heavy metal and all kinds of stuff that, at 11 o'clock. And again, it's like I had a TV in my room with a cable box, and I spent the summers with my dad. So that's where I was able to watch this stuff. And I remember seeing all kinds of stuff that I probably shouldn't have been watching because my bedroom was on the far end of the house and then the master bedroom was on the other side. So it was easy to wake up late at night and turn that on and keep the volume down real low and watch things, watch R-rated movies, that like I said, it's probably like, 8 or 9, 10 years old. So those were fun times and certainly had a big impact on, I think, the trajectory of what I saw myself doing down the road as far as a career.
The one scam I ran on my parents, which wasn't really a scam, but it was kind of a scam, is I would defend certain R-rated movies by saying, well, if it was rated today, it'd be PG-13.
Right. God, and you go back and you look at movies that were PG back in the day, and you're kind of like, how did this make it through the rating system? How is this not PG? And I think that's why they ended up with that, that new one. I think Red Dawn was the first PG-13 rated movie, as I recall.
Yeah.
So that's another one which I think I saw on cable, probably in '85 because I think that came out in '84.
Oh yeah, I saw that one a little young. We had that on VHS.
Yeah, and that was one of those movies which was actually sparked debate within households. I remember I had 2 older brothers, 8 and 11 years on me, stepbrothers, and I remember sitting around listening to them talk with my parents, and even my parents talking about Red Dawn because the whole idea of a land invasion of America was pretty controversial at the time. And you go back and you look at what John did there, and you see what the battle plan was for the Soviets teaming up with the Cubans and the coming up through the borders, and it's really genius. It sounds like it would work. It actually, but it's funny because like we stop them at the Rockies and they don't get really as far north as sort of like Texas. So it's like the center of the country holds and fights everybody off. It's just movies.
It's good fantasy.
It is. It's so believable. All these movies or any kind of good entertainment is all about suspension of disbelief. And if you don't have that suspension of disbelief, there's no authenticity. Nobody's willing to go on that journey with you and believe it. Have that authenticity or the verisimilitude, as Dick Donner used to say. So it's that scene around the campfire with Powers Booth where they're talking about how it all went down. And Red Dawn, I think they're supposed to be in Colorado, but I think they filmed in Utah, as I recall. But either way, it's such a brilliant movie. It's like every Gen X's kid's fantasy to shoot communists and live off the land and be some guerrilla outfit in the middle of the mountains, taking pot shots at communists and and then taking all their weapons, and it's. I mean, I remember thinking to myself back then, is this a possible future? Like, is this something that could actually happen? And how would it be? It'd probably be pretty rough. It wouldn't be anywhere near as romantic, but either way, John always romanticizes that stuff so perfectly. So I did a political punks one time with Amanda Milius, and we talked about this. We talked about the movie quite a bit because Shout Factory has a really good Blu-ray of Red Dawn, and it's got a couple of DVD extras behind the scenes and whatnot. Nothing really with John too much, but with the editor and the cinematographer and a couple other people that talk about sort of some of the behind the scenes stuff. It's also got some great interviews with Leah Thompson and a couple of the other actors. So Tommy Howell's not in there, unfortunately.
One of the things about Red Dawn is, and not to go all, woo artistic on people, but it really is supposed to be sort of, and this is what John Milius was talking about, his inspiration, is it really is supposed to be like, what if Afghanistan, but in America? What if the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but in America? Right. And so all the rest of the scenario is just to set up these kids in the Colorado mountains fighting Russians, just like, Afghani kids in the
just mountains.
Like
the Mujahideen. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, the rest of it, people are debating it. What are the realities of this? Could this really happen? And everybody's like, well, it could never happen. It's like, that's not the point. It's not the point of the movie. It's like, what would it be like for you if your hometown was occupied and they set up, these camps and re-education camps? Because this is what the Russians, this is what the Soviets are really like. This is what they're doing around the globe, man. It just put yourselves in these people's shoes. That's what it's about.
Well, even down to the details of once they occupy the town, and Jed and the other two guys go into the grocery store, and if you notice that the shelves are empty, there's very few things that are for sale. It looks like a Soviet store. It looks like something in Venezuela or a communist country where you don't have 12 different brands of mayonnaise. And that's the one thing, if you talk to anybody that came from the old Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc. I had a friend who, a guy that was my mechanic back when I was in high school. He used to work on my Scout. His name was Henry Badouche, and he was probably in his late 30s, early 40s. And he was Polish and went on a hunger strike, chained himself to the U.S. Embassy when Poland was still under the Iron Curtain. Chained himself to the U.S. Embassy, went on a hunger strike for 48 hours to get his family to defect. And America took him in, and he ended up escaping before the wall came down. You talk to anybody from that world that came to America, and the first thing they'll tell you is usually how they went into a U.S. grocery store and started weeping because they'd never seen anything like that before. Nothing. They'd never seen that kind of abundance. Not just that much food, okay? But like I said, 12 different brands of ketchup, and 10 different types of mayonnaise, and sourdough bread, wheat, buns with sesame seeds, buns without. I mean, we take this stuff so for granted, and it's not until you talk to people who wait 8 hours in line, with basically a wheelbarrow full of cash, to buy a loaf of bread. They don't get to choose what kind it is. They take what they can get because that's all that country can yield. That's just through brutal oppression, and also starvation, basically. But yeah, I think what John did there, a lot of people say it's some right-wing fantasy. I think Pauline Kael called it that. And it's not, it's a very subversive movie. And what it did was it got that conversation going. And I think that was the intent. And one of the things we talked about with Amanda was, I said, I think it's one of the most anti-war films I've ever seen. And even in light of all of the, Wolverines and all this stuff, this bravado and this machismo and, all that stuff that I love and that, gets my blood pumping. It's partisan rock at the end, which just breaks your heart, because that's the way all of these wars sort of end up, some statue or some monument that nobody ever goes to, that nobody remembers, and America survives, obviously, so it has somewhat of a happy ending. But John shot that movie in sequence from start to end. So he started off at the high school, and he ends up with the Eckert brothers dying, and then the last scene is at Partisan Rock with their names etched on that red rock, and he did that on purpose to grind down the actors. He wanted them war torn and beat
I love
up.
it when they do that. Actors deserve it.
It doesn't happen often. Budgets, sort of get in the way of that, and scheduling and all that stuff. It wasn't a very big film. The other thing was where they shot, there was all the Russian actors in that movie are real. They all came from a college where they were teaching Russian. So, and I think some of the Russian students were learning English, but, to shoot in sequence like that in order to get the kids to, and they were kids back then, aside from, I think, Patrick, I just think that's so brilliant. And it just doesn't happen these days because these budgets are so big and there's so much riding on the money. And, I love it. I don't even know what the budget was on Red Dawn, but I bet it was pretty small, So I mean, there's more creative freedom within that, and you can sort of take your time, I guarantee you, there's no reshoots on Red Dawn. There's no pickup shots, more than likely not. So, but it's a good movie. And it's another one where it's just sort of like when I heard that they were going to remake it, I was just like, why?
Why? It's already perfect.
It's was it Robert Downey Jr. is going to make he's going to remake Vertigo, and I don't know why. It's just sort of like with Gus Van Sant shooting Psycho, shot for shot. Even shot for shot. I'm just kind of like, is this sort of some educational exercise or something? Like what is this about? Some things should just be left alone, and it's one of the reasons why I was happy they're going to make a sequel to Blade Runner rather than a remake. And I thought what Denis did was brilliant. I just think it was just way too long. He could have cut. Ridley's like, yeah, I would have cut like about a half hour out of that movie. I'm like, a half hour? I would have cut like 45 minutes out of that movie. I mean, there's these scenes in 2049 where, just these shots that just linger. And being a visual guy, I love that stuff. But at the same time, this, we're not looking at paintings. This is a movie. We're making a movie, and it's got to have, it's got to keep the pace. And I get kind of bored with 2049 in a lot of sequences. So, but I was talking to somebody online the other day about what Hans Zimmer did on that movie, because Vangelis' score on that first one is just so brilliant, and it's like one of the most amazing scores of all time. And there's only one Vangelis, and he's gone too. But I think what Hans did on that was have all of these. He was able to make it familiar, yet fresh and engaging and interesting, and to the point where I kept thinking, I wish Vangelis was around to hear this, because I think he would have liked it. Another good score is Black Rain. I just watched that recently. Awesome. And again, it's Hans Zimmer.
Oh yeah, Black Rain is an amazing movie that just kind of disappeared, but it really is a great flick.
It's Jan de Bont. I mean, one of the best cinematographers of all time. I mean, you can argue about his directorial skills, but when it comes to shooting a film, I don't think there's anybody that defined the '80s visually better than Jan de Bont.
When he is in the meeting and he is, he's got the ambush prepped and moving in, and he voluntarily cuts off his finger just to trick them into not paying attention so the ambush can come forward. You're just like, dude, that is pure dedication.
I've watched and I'm one of those guys that watches the audio commentary, and especially anything Ridley does, I watch the audio commentary. And Ridley gets all squeamish during that scene when he crunches the knife down, and Ridley's like, "Ugh, gross." It's just Ridley's audio commentary is great, and I encourage anybody to watch anything with Kurt Russell, whether it's the Used Cars audio commentary where he's sitting with the two Bobs, Zemeckis and Gale, and I think they're basically getting drunk and just laughing their asses off. But really, Carpenter and Russell together on audio commentary is just classic, absolutely classic. I've watched The Thing audio commentary with those two guys, and also Big Trouble in Little China, and it's just constant laughter. Kurt's just like, ha, you just got this cackle, John's laughing. It's just hilarious. But it's fun to watch artists go back and sort of recall things and talk about why they made certain decisions and point things out. I think you got to be definitely a pop culture geek to really get into that kind of stuff. But I always have, and that's one of the reasons why I always buy hard copies, because you don't get that kind of stuff with obviously the digital downloads and all this stuff these days, which is a real shame. Plus you miss out on cover art and all that stuff. That Shout Factory Red Dawn release has a beautiful watercolor cover of what's his name, who screams Wolverines. It's not Tommy Howell, it's the other dude, Arvit or whatever his name is. But it's got him on the cover with holding up the AK. But buy hard copies, everybody, because when the cloud fails, that's all you're going to be left with. And funny enough, in Blade Runner 29, they talk about how the cloud collapses and all of this information and all this art and entertainment and all this historical stuff it's just gone. It's gone forever.
I want to go back to specifically 2049, actually. One of the things that a movie maker has complete control of when they make their movies is pacing. But one of the things that comic book makers don't have as much control over is pacing, because people who are reading are going to zoom ahead or not. And so I read this commentary on it, and ever since then, I have always been kind of keeping it in the back of my mind when I read comic books. Is they said a lot of the things we do when we're doing art for a comic book is to kind of get people to slow down and pay attention to the art.
Mm-hmm.
And that made me do two things. One, it made me read comic books much, much slower so I could pay attention to the art. And I was like, that's a good point. I've been reading comic books up till now way too fast. I don't appreciate
Most people do.
the art.
Yeah.
So I started reading it a lot slower. And two, I've been trying to notice things that they're doing to make me slow down and try and pay attention to the art.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has given me just a brand new appreciation. And this happened several years ago for the level of skill that goes into not just, there are people who do good panels that tell this story, and you can tell that they've worked really hard and they know how to do stuff. And then there are people who do great things beyond just the art necessary to tell the story. They are working on a whole nother level behind
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, they're similar mediums, but they're also very different. And speaking of 2049, there's obviously shots in that movie where nothing's happening. And movies and TV can get away with that, but comics really can't. There's always got to be something happening in each panel, some kind of action or something which advances the reader to the next panel. So there's kind of a built-in sort of mechanism there. And I think you're right. I think people do read them way too fast, and where you're sort of locked into the pacing of a movie, whether you like it or not. You're not dictating the pace. So the editing is, and the cinematographer is. But with comics, I think it's the good artists make you notice and discover new things sometimes when you go back and reread stuff. And J.G. Jones does that to me. Brian Hitch does that for me. There's a lot of guys where I miss things, and then I go back and I'm like, oh God, how did I miss that? I remember in the Ultimates when they kidnapped George W. Bush from the White House. There's a plate of pretzels on his desk. And if you remember, Bush almost died choking on a pretzel during his term. So, and I always encourage my artists to add things in. If I remember on Clinton Cash, I was having a conversation with Graham Nolan about one of his chapters, and he said, I said, if you see an opening somewhere to add something in visually that's funny and satirical, do it, even if it's not in the script. I tried to give those guys as much creative freedom on that project as possible because I was given total creative freedom on that project. So much creative freedom that I knew at the time that I would never get this kind of creative freedom ever again unless I was doing my own thing. And it was mainly because the guys that hired me to do it, Peter Schweizer and Steve Bannon, they didn't know how to make comics. They didn't have a clue. I remember when they came to me and they said, we have the graphic rights to Clinton Cash and we want to make a graphic novel out of it. I said, so what? What are you going to do with it? What's it, what do you want it to look like? What's the tone? And they're like, we don't know. That's why we're hiring you. You go figure that out. You're the comic guy with, almost 30 years of experience. And I was like, at the time, I was like, I'm a comic guy, but I'm a colorist. I've never produced anything like this before. I've never been the guy who runs it, who puts the creative team together and then manages the production. That was never my gig. However, I've been doing it for so long, and I started in the 90s, when we were still using traditional mediums with Chaos Comics. So it was Brian Polito that hired me for that was my first gig out of high school. And that only came about because we shopped at the same comic book store, but I remember telling Sergio Cariello and Graham and Paul Ravoche and Don Hudson, if you can make these panels funnier, if you want to add stuff in the background, do it. And I remember on one thing that Graham did was there's a chapter head page, which we would do splash pages for, and it's called the Clinton Blur, and it's sort of making Bill Clinton sort of like the Flash, and he's running through the scene, and it's like a parody cover, and one of the, and I should preface this by saying that when we did Clinton Cash, and I remember thinking in the beginning, I said to those guys, I said, the tone has to be funny. We've got to use humor. And at the time, I was watching a lot of Sopranos, and the first 3 seasons of Sopranos have a lot of satire and a lot of humor, and it's one of the reasons why I like the first 3 seasons the best. Really, the first season I think is the best, and then it gets very dark, super dark, especially towards the end, and I think that's kind of the intent. But Sopranos starts out very playful, especially when the kids are still at home, because it's sort of like this quasi sitcom in a lot of ways. But there's a lot of sort of like Scorsese-ish sort of satire, like built into the writing, and I loved that. And then I also at the same around the same time I had just seen Dr. Strangelove. I'd never seen that before, and I was just blown away. I was just like, my God. I mean, how Stanley never went back and did another satirical comedy like that is just sort of beyond me. But then I was like, well, he's sort of like, how do you outdo that? How do you outdo Strangelove, right? So I told him, I said, this has to be satire. And I knew after my first meeting with those guys that I needed Chuck, because Chuck was probably the only guy I knew who would say yes to it. He'd be fearless enough to say yes to it, wouldn't be afraid of being blacklisted. And then also Chuck had adapted The Forgotten Man by Amity Shlaes, which is a book about the Great Depression. And it's a probably even more boring and dry book than Clinton Cash. And he and Paul Revouche turned it into a #1 New York Times bestseller. So when I got on the phone with Chuck and I told him, sort of what I wanted to do, or tonally how I saw Clinton Cash turning out and being adapted, I said, we got to do satire. And I said, I'm thinking Sopranos meets Dr. Strangelove. And he's like, yeah, totally satire. It's got to be satire. But he's like, it's got to be National Lampoon satire. And I'm talking like 70s National Lampoon when Henry Beard and Doug Kenny were running it, before Doug left and went to Hollywood and made Caddyshack and Animal House and became a Hollywood guy. But those guys were the founders. They came out of Harvard and they had done the Harvard Lampoon. And then they went to New York and pitched it to Maddie Simmons and launched the magazine. And National Lampoon was the premier satire and comedy magazine of that era. There wasn't anything funnier. But Chuck's his observation was so brilliant, because I had missed that magazine. I was too young really to, for me, National Lampoon was sort of a TNA magazine in the 80s once PJ O'Rourke had taken over. You did have some great writers like John Hughes that came out of the Lampoon, and things like Vacation 58, which then turned out to be National Lampoon's Vacation. But Chuck was kind of like, what we need to do is make this super satirical, but no big heads, no caricatures, nothing like Mad Magazine or Cracked. It's got to be, the artwork has to be straight. And that's the brilliance of the Lampoon, was that the artwork was straight, whether it was Neil Adams, whether it was Russ Heath. But the point was that the artwork didn't fight the joke. It didn't fight the humor. It was the straight man, and then the humor was built into the images. So Graham came to me, and Chuck had written this great panel of the Clinton blur. Bill Clinton's running through it, and people are like, is he a politician? Is he a businessman? Is he both? And it's this really funny panel. Graham comes to me and he goes, "Can I put a cheeseburger in his hand?" And I'm like, "Yes, do that," because that's kind of like the old jokes about Clinton and the Secret Service. Phil Hartman did a great SNL sketch where he goes to McDonald's, and instead of buying anything, he just walks around and takes bites out of everyone else's food. And but I just thought, those are the type of things that why you hire somebody like Graham Nolan, because they're going to bring things to the table that Chuck or I would never come up with. But again, it's kind of like that was part of the fun of that project, was giving everyone as much creative freedom as possible, because when you do that, inhibitions are gone, and it's just about creating things within that world and plussing those scenes and making them more than what they normally would be. That's sort of what's so brilliant about comics, is that you've got these isolated frames of art, and you can do so much more with them in a lot of ways than you can with cinema, because you're dealing with a single image. So you can build all kinds of things into it, all kinds of background detail, even things outside of the focal point where people normally are not looking, and that's what I love about comics, is that it's so much, in a lot of ways, it's a much more immersive medium than TV and film, because like what you're talking about, you can linger on these panels, you can linger on these covers and on these splash pages and whatnot, and discover new things that you might have not seen because you were kind of blasting through it too quickly the first time around, So that was a long way of making that point.
I appreciate it because I think I had a similar experience years and years ago with Watchmen. I think that was my version of that
Yeah,
story
so
where
right. Oh,
and
Dave Gibbons.
amazing artwork, and they put so much stuff into every frame. When I was a child and first given it to read, I I barely followed what was going on,
Me too.
and it didn't take very long, but it was a long time in between my next reading of it. And when I went through it, just the first couple of panels where you're like, oh, they're actually trying. It's the funeral for the comedian. Oh, they're trying to showcase this weird hobo uh, doomsayer character right here in the background here, and of course after you read it, you know exactly who that is, and
Right.
but it's like, oh, all this stuff was right there in my face this whole time.
And they
Why
couldn't
didn't I
do that
actually
in the
look at the
film.
panels?
You couldn't do that in the film. You know, I mean, if you had him in the background, it's nothing you'd ever. So that's why it's like that scene opens up with Rorschach. You know, or at least it makes him more prominent. You know, but in comics you can kind of bury that stuff in the background, and whether the reader notices or not the first time around is, it's kind of up to whether or not you're paying attention or if you're reading it too fast. But yeah, Dave's stuff on that is just so immersive. It's got such density and depth. You know, he and Brian Boland. I see a lot of similarities in their styles, but they're both very dense artists. Whether you're looking at Watchmen or like old Judge Dredd. I mean, there's so much going on in the background, and that's what's kind of so great about guys like Ridley is they sort of do the same thing. They world build by putting all of this detail and all of this density to where you feel like you're like in this immersive space. You're really there. I felt like that on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I felt like that was one of the first really immersive movies that I had watched in a long time, where I felt like I was there. I was in that world, and I was traveling in that little Carmen Gia with Brad Pitt. People complained about those shots. Oh, it's just, why are all these shots of Brad Pitt driving? It's like it's art. It's beautiful cinematography. And Brad
You're,
Pitt's a handsome guy. I mean, what are we complaining about here? And you've got all these.
you
Quentin said that those shots from below, looking up at Brad, was supposed to be him in his dad's Carmen Gia when he was a little kid. That's
you
what his point of view was.
you're being immersed in the California that existed at that time.
All those
That
signs going by, the KFC and the billboards, and yeah,
it's
yeah,
a California that would stop existing in part in our timeline because of the Manson murders.
right,
The Manson murders would come along, and then the other crime of the 1970s would wipe out that California. It would stop existing. And so, I mean, yes,
that's a
he's
great
writing a
point.
movie about that California where the Manson murders would be wiped away. But in our world, it's gone. It gets wiped out. And the
I know.
music you hear, the
Yeah,
sights you see, it's just a love letter to that moment in time that is within a year or two is going to be wiped away. It
yeah,
is not about the time. It's not about even the visuals. It is about the feeling that is supposed to evoke in you.
yeah.
Again, not to go poetic and woo woo on you. I
No,
just,
but you're right, man. I mean, I think we overlook how movies make us feel.
yeah,
And I remember a time when movies made you feel good, and you walked out and you were on a high, and you couldn't wait to go and watch it again. Partially because it was a great adventure, obviously, but you want to feel that way again. And Top Gun Maverick did that for me. It was very bittersweet. Um, I remember being a little sad that Tony wasn't involved in this, but I feel like they captured the same high that I felt when I walked out of Top Gun in '86. And I thought Maverick just captured that same feeling, but it's a similar feeling that you get with great entertainment. And it's one of the reasons why we want to go back and watch these movies, whether it's in the theater or at home. It's no different than a great comic book or a graphic novel. If it makes you feel good, you want to experience that hero's journey again and again and again. It never gets old, but that's what great art does. It evokes a feeling in you that you want to experience again. That's sort of the whole point. It's not so much the messaging, it's not so much the visuals, it's all of those things combined, which evokes those feelings. And there's just too few filmmakers and even creators within comics these days who are able to, make people evoke those feelings and awaken those feelings, that we used to have. And I feel bad for younger kids, younger millennials and obviously Gen Z who have never experienced that feeling before, walking out of a theater on such a high and just being like, wow, that was awesome. Do you want to go see that again? We used to say that all the time, yeah, let's go see it again.
So I got a couple of points there. I think the one thing that's really killing us, I know that you're really focused on the writing and the craftsmanship, but I think that movies nowadays are leaning so heavily into non-stop animated spectacle, where you get 2 hours of Paul Rudd and what's her bucket jumping around in front of a green screen.
It's just
That's
junk. Yeah.
it's not going to excite anybody.
No.
It's like one of those fake rides at a show. Oh no, we're in danger. Or if you've ever been to they used to have these big fancy IMAX 3D shows
Mhm.
where it was basically you just sit in a seat and watch some roller coaster style adventure
Right.
on a on a on a 3D
Mhm.
screen, and it's just like there's no there.
Yeah.
You're just sort of you're being shown someone having fun on a roller coaster instead of actually being on a ride. If you want that experience, go get on a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
I
it's like comparing, like what you're talking about to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a roller coaster ride. This is a grand adventure. John Milius talks about, the in Conan, in that opening monologue, talking about this is the days of high adventure. It's like, what happened to that? Hollywood used to be the town of high adventure. Because it didn't have to rely on that kind of stuff. And as great as the CG stuff is, it is such a crutch, and it's such a weak crutch at this point. And that's kind of why I think that John Wick just crushed Ant-Man. Squashed it like a bug, pardon the pun. I have not seen it, but Larry was telling me that there's some just brilliant cinematography of these fight scenes from above. He tells me about that he said I've got to see in the theater and experience. But he said, nobody wants to see Doctor Strange turning buildings upside down and inside out anymore. And I think he's right. I think that all this stuff is just tired and worn out. And unfortunately, as great as comic books are and comic book heroes are, and there's some, obviously there's some of the greatest stories. It's American mythology. It's no different than Perseus or Theseus or anything that came out of Greek myths. This is our myth. Batman is our mythology. Iron Man is our mythology. And you just compare that first Iron Man film, which is all about the journey of Tony, or that first Batman Begins, which is all about the journey of Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, becoming more than just a man. That scene that Liam Neeson has with Christian in that prison cell, it's not very long, but man, that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I watch it. It is just, it's such brilliant story making and storytelling. And then on top of that, it's something that taps into each and every one of us. What are we going to make of our lives? What are we going to do? Are we, are we going to become something more than just a man, or will we become a legend? And I just think that the story has been lost, and the the ability to tell that timeless story around the campfire for generations. They've substituted that with CG and special effects that is all computer generated, and it not only jacks the prices of these movies through the stratosphere, but and then that turns it into this very high risk reward scenario, because if you're going to spend $250 million on a movie, it's got to be a sure thing. So you got a lot riding on it. Whereas why don't you take that $250 million and go and make 8 movies or 9 movies for, and spread your risk out and tell a good story, have less CG. You don't need to be dependent on all that stuff. You don't have to have, what they're doing is they're substituting good stories for spectacle, and where it's a lot harder to tell a good story and have good characters that you want to invest in, for not only an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours, but for multiple movies, multiple film franchises. It's hard to make characters that people identify with. It takes talent, and Hollywood, it just doesn't have the stable of talent that it used to have, and that's sort of what we're all sort of, guys like us, we're seeing what's missing is that auteur, that Brian De Palma, that Scorsese, that John Milius. Those guys were auteurs and they had a vision, but they also knew that they had to work with the studio to make something commercial, something that was going to make money. But there's an incentive there for them. They make money, and then they get to go and have more leverage creatively going forward. That's sort of Clint's whole deal is, with Warner Brothers. It was originally I make 2 or 3 for you, and then you make 1 for me. And that's kind of the deal that Clint had with Warner Brothers. And now it's sort of like, Clint, just go make whatever you want, and we'll cover the costs, because, even though he's he either knocks it out of the park or he doesn't. There's some brilliant movies that Clint has done, which were, you could argue, are stinkers. Maybe they didn't perform as well. But that's the other thing, this idea that, we judge a movie based on, how much money it made, that's also kind of a problem. But it's even more of a problem when you've got $250 to $300 million to make back. If you've got a $20 million film, it's like, look at those S. Craig Zoller films. Those are great films. Brawl in Cell Block 99 is a brilliant film. And I always, whenever I tell people to check out an S. Craig Zoller film, that's the first one I tell them. I don't tell them Bone Tomahawk. I tell them watch Brawl in Cell Block 99, because it's a little bit less gnarly. But Bone Tomahawk's a
putting that on my
film.
list.
He's an amazing artist, or he just made a graphic novel. He's a strange dude, but he's definitely a man out of time. He should have come out of the 70s, But all those guys from the USC Mafia back in the day, even Lucas, those guys were really special, and
I
they just don't come around all the time.
saw. I thought I recognized the name of that film. I just watched Drag It Across Concrete last week for the first time.
What'd you think?
I thought it was everything I expected, but also nothing that I expected.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. He does that. He does that in all of his films.
What I really liked, I guess he directed and wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
This is good because we haven't done an actual movie review on the show in a while, but Dragged Across Concrete, it is one of those films that takes its time to set up every scenario and every character, and it doesn't do it like. Let me contrast it with a Guy Ritchie film. This could have been done by Guy Ritchie, and if Guy Ritchie did it, it would have had all the goofy characters with the funny accents, and the music would build to a crescendo as everything went to hell in a handbasket at the end.
Yeah.
But no, it does go to hell in a handbasket at the end, just like you expect it to. But I thought it was, and I hate to use this cliche, but like I thought it was interesting and gripping the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And I should have at the end of the movie said, man, that was way too long, but I didn't.
It goes. The pacing on movies deceptively fast. Same with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Every time I watch it, I don't feel like I'm sitting there for nearly 3 hours, or whatever it is. It goes by so fast,
Yeah.
and there's so many scenes where I almost wish it would kind of linger. You know, there's scenes in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood where I want to hang out with Brad and Leo. I want to hang out with those characters more. I want to get drunk with them more. You know, Dragged Across Concrete for me. I loved Mel Gibson's character. I loved all of the percentages, 50-50, 70-30.
It was really weird. Yeah.
It is, but it's one of those things where it's like one of those ticks that you put into a character that says so much about them. You can learn so much about them. Chuck and I were talking about Casino, and the scene where De Niro is talking to what's his name, the guy that plays Phil Green. Oh shit. He's a
I
stand-up
forget the actor's name.
stand-up comedian, does a great Shatner. My middle-aged mind will come to it probably in the next 15 minutes. But sitting there having blueberry muffins, and De Niro says, in the middle of all of this, hey, you're losing money on this, and you're doing this and this and this. They're going through.
Don Rickles.
No, it's not Don Rickles. It's oh God, it'll come to me. But anyway, Don Rickles is brilliant in that movie. He says, Robert De Niro interrupts him, and he goes, wait a minute. He goes, look at your blueberry muffin. And he's like, yeah, what about it? He's like, look at all the blueberries it has in it. And he's like, well, I don't get what you're saying. And he's like, well, look at mine. It has none. He's like, yours is falling apart with blueberries, and mine has none. So then they cut to the bakery in the casino, and he's lecturing the cook, the baker. He's like, look at these two blueberry muffins. One is falling apart with blueberries, and one has none. I want an equal amount of blueberries in each muffin. And the baker's looking at him like, do you know how long that's going to take? I don't care how long it takes. An equal amount of blueberries in each muffin. Chuck and I were talking about that, and he says, great writing can tell you all about a character in 5 minutes. You can learn everything about this guy in 5 minutes, and that is a lesson in how to build a character. This guy is detail oriented. He's OCD. He's a control freak. But that's also why he's got the top performing casino in Las Vegas.
He's meticulous.
Exactly. But I mean, the percentages and all that stuff, with Mel's character, that's just telling you about the kind of guy that he is. It's one of those things which often gets overlooked as just some weird banter, but this guy's got some kind of an issue. He's got some kind of a weird tick where everything's like these percentages, and he's always like running the numbers, and he's probably, he probably does that with everything. I felt that I had no idea where that movie was going to go. And like a lot of S. Craig Zoller films, they really go off the rails. You think it's going one way, and then all of a sudden it veers left and off of a cliff. And as you're going over the cliff, you're just like, wait, no, don't stop. That's not what I figured was going to happen. And it's like when Vince Vaughn gets killed in that movie, I'm just kind of like, oh shit. I never saw that coming. And it kind of bugged me. But I admire directors.
I was going to say, that scene bugged me in particular. That scene bugged me in particular. That was the only part of the film where I was like, this isn't really going to work, is it? Like, their ruse isn't going to work.
Exactly.
He's not going to fall for this.
Exactly.
And it happens.
Exactly. And that's what's missing in Hollywood these days. And that's what's missing in comics and in storytelling and visual storytelling. Creatives who are willing to take risks and make really hard decisions, to the point where the audience isn't quite sure, like, oh shit, like where did that come from? And it reminds me of a movie called Dark of the Sun, which is one of my probably my favorite movie about mercenaries. It's got Jim Brown and Rod Taylor from The Time Machine. And at that point in time, Rod Taylor had kind of been sort of pigeonholed into action type stuff, which isn't a bad thing. He was a really masculine, tough, big guy, and he could pull it off. But Dark of the Sun is a must-see. It is a fantastic film. And it's amazing. Rod Taylor, white guy, Jim Brown, obviously, black guy, famous football player. These guys these guys have the biggest bromance you'll ever see. These guys love each other, and it's 1969. Don't tell me that America's racist, because that's bullshit. We've been getting over that for a long time. And Dark of the Sun is a great example of a interracial relationship between two mercenaries who are basically brothers. They don't see color. They're just brothers. They love each other because they've been in combat, and they've been under fire, and they've been through all kinds of hell together. You don't see any of that in the movie other than what takes place in the movie. You don't see anything about their past, but you just know that these guys, they're just bonded, man. And nothing could ever get in the way of that. And the ending, I won't give it away, also sort of exemplifies their bond. And but that's a movie where Chuck had recommended it to me, and I remember watching it, and like Dragged Across Concrete and a lot of S. Craig Zoller films, it just goes absolutely off the rails at the end. And what can go wrong will go wrong, and does. And this guy, this director, I forget, he was a cinematographer and who made, I forget the guy's name who directed it, but he was a really, really famous and successful cinematographer in Hollywood who went and directed a couple of his own films, one of which was Dark of the Sun. And it goes so far out on the left field at the end. And if it's your first time watching it, you'd never figure that's where it was going. But again, it's like these guys, these creatives, these directors and artists who aren't afraid to make really, really hard decisions, and completely veer away from formula and what the audience is expecting. And I think that is so missing in today's entertainment, and that's part of great storytelling is surprising people, and being like, you walk out and you're just like, did you figure that was going to happen? And you're just like, no way. That was nuts. That was crazy. But that's why it was so awesome, and that's why we love these guys, is that they take us on these journeys and we think it's going one way, and then all of a sudden it's like going the other way. Sorry. But this is the way it is.
And speaking of which, I'm going to abruptly segue. We normally go for about an hour, so I'm gonna abruptly jump in and say, I want to know. I have a question, and I hope DW maybe has more questions before we go. You mentioned this. You mentioned something along these lines earlier when you were talking about giving the artists in a comic freedom to add things that add detail or humor to the panels. So what do you do in your work? What do you do to make that magic happen? What do you do to tell a better story, +1, and so on?
I think colorists might have more creative freedom than anybody in the production chain, because a lot of the times I don't get any requests. I don't get any notes other than what's in the script. Daytime, nighttime. Most of the time, over 28 years, it's been my interpretation. I largely get to do what I want. It's one of the best parts of being a colorist, is that unlike the artist or the writer who gets, obviously has to work within a box. I always used to ask Chuck, is it hard to write Batman because you've got this 80-year-old IP that has all of this canon? And he said, no. He goes, it's fun, but he said it is writing in a box, and you have to be able to get creative inside that box. So it could be hard for some people, but for him, it's an opportunity to be creative. Same with Superman. How do you do something different with that character? Well, it all depends on your level of talent working inside the box. So for me, and it's same with the artists. I mean, they're dictated by what the writer does. They're also working kind of inside of a box where, I'm the cinematographer. I'm the guy that does the special effects. So I paint with light. I paint with texture. I probably dial in the focal points. even more than what the artist does. I add muzzle flares. I add glows to lightsabers. You do all of that stuff that the special effects guys do as well. So the colorist is ultimately the purveyor of lighting and special effects. And from the standpoint of lighting, lighting makes you feel things. Laura Martin said that. She said that, a good colorist will make you feel. The first thing that happens when you look at a cover of a comic book, obviously you're looking at images that you either characters you recognize or maybe you don't, different situations, but it's very different when you look at an inked page, black and white, and then you looked at the colored version. The colored version evokes feelings, at least it should. A good colorist understands how to use colors to evoke certain types of feelings in people. And I think that a colorist's job is to obviously plus the artwork and make it more than what it is. I don't care who it is. I mean, I've worked with Walt Simonson. I've worked with Frank Cho. I've worked with Mark Bagley, John Malin. These guys are all masters. They're great at what they do. They're great visual storytellers. But at the end of the day, they rely on us to make it, kind of complete the whole package, to make it finished art, and bring it to life, even more life than what it has as inked black and white imagery. So, for me, I just try and give each panel, depth, kind of overall. You render a page, obviously, right? So there's things that go into that: composition, focal points, fundamentals, color theory, using warms and cools. And I pull a lot from film more than I do from other colorists. There are colorists that I think are just incredible. Laura Martin's one of them. The late great Justin Ponser, probably one of my favorite colorists of all time. God bless him. Frank D'Armata, God, that guy is just insane. You want to talk about economy? That guy is just, that guy. I mean, he's so fast. I wish I was that fast. Chuck worked with him at CrossGen, and Frank would bang out a page by about noon, and you'd always know when Frank was done because he'd be like, "It's Millet time," and then he'd be out. He'd just leave. But like, I think that good colorists, obviously, elevate the artwork. They should. And it's not just about adding muzzle flares and special effects, but it's really about doing what Jordan Cronenweth did on Blade Runner and what Jan de Bont does. And that's why I defer to film a lot of the times when I'm looking for inspiration. Ridley always, uses the best cinematographers. I remember when I first started working in hi-fi design back in 2003, Brian Buccellato and Val Staples, Jason Keith, these are all guys that were sitting right next to me. And they retaught me how to color. And they were always telling me to go and look at film. Brian Pulido also told me to go and watch film and go and look. He said, go down this was in the 90s. He said, go down to the library and check out a bunch of books on cinematography. He said, because I remember when I started coloring for Chaos, I had a very Marvel superhero-y style. That was not the Chaos style, not at all. So Brian came from the world of film and video. He was directed videos. He was a assistant director. So he tried to pull a lot of film influence, and also Stephen Hughes as well pulled a lot of film influence, because Stephen wasn't a comic book artist when they formed Chaos. But I try and look at film. I think that comics emulate film and film emulate comics now, probably more than ever. They always have had sort of a symbiotic sort of relationship between each other, because at the end of the day, it is visual storytelling. So there's going to be some overlap there. But, the fundamentals of cinematography and the fundamentals of what a colorist does are very similar. And even the digital colorists on the film side, so much is reliant on the colorists now. And that's all done in post-production, where they go in and they literally tweak the warms and the cools and whatnot in post-production. It's very similar to what I do and what I try and do. And I've been doing some stuff for Eric July recently. and it's beautiful art. And I remember when we first started working together, I was like, he was blown away by. I did the cover for Isom 2, which I'm looking forward to people seeing because it's beautiful, it's gorgeous, and I really liked how it turned out. And I just remember thinking, when I look at it now, I'm kind of like, I see what I'm pulling from. It's like I do it and I render it and I turn it in, and then I go back, maybe like a week later or whatever, and I look at it and I see different things, and it's like subliminal, what I'm doing. But so much of it is pulled from film. Whether it's adding atmospherics like dust and smoke to add layers and to build depth of feel, or whether it's using warm and cools in order to use center in on focal points, meaning where your eye needs to go to first. So much of it is just pulled from basic, sort of art and design fundamentals, which I think these days is kind of lost because so many people think that if you go and you learn a program like Photoshop and you read a book about how to color comics, that you're a colorist. That's not the case. Back in the day, back in the 90s, you had to not only understand how to use traditional mediums like alcohol markers and gouache, colored pencil, and pro white and all this stuff, but you also had to utilize those traditional mediums correctly, and that had to come from a basic foundation in art and design and understanding what works and what has always worked, and going back and looking at Caravaggio and looking at the Baroque period and looking at Rembrandt, going back and looking at old masters. These guys understood. Gordon Willis, when he shot the Godfather, I mean that was all about Caravaggio. All that darkness and isolating characters in light and having those shadows, and it's one of those things that I learned the hard way. When you're coloring, rendering is not about highlights. It's about shadows. Shadows give things depth and shape, not highlights. And you learn that over the years just by doing, and also looking at other people's work and emulating it. And I've certainly done that. I'm not ashamed to admit that. Part of my modern day palette that I color with is half Jason Keith and half Justin Ponser, because I worked as Jason Keith I colored books with Jason Keith for about 3 years at Marvel. In the business, we call that ghosting. Basically, Jason took on more than he could take, and so we would split books together. I wouldn't get credit, but he'd pay me, and I learned to ape his style, and then that ended up becoming part of my style. And then I really got into Justin Ponser's stuff after that, and that's kind of where I look to these days. And for before Jason, I was looking at Laura Martin, and funny enough, she taught Jason and Justin and Frank kind of how to. She sort of established the cross-gen style when they were all in-house at CrossGen back in the early 2000s. So, and that's kind of my style. I love those old CrossGen books, man, like Ruse and Scion. God, those are just beautiful books. They're just absolutely gorgeous.
You were talking about chiaroscuro.
What's that?
Chiaroscuro is the use of high highs and low lows to define three-dimensional to emulate three-dimensional space in a picture with Caravaggio and some of those other Baroque artists.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that's what it was called, dude. But you learn something every day. That's cool.
The term. I've been looking at art.
Well, and a lot of it is the triangle. That's one element of it. As far as like lighting and shading and stuff like that, and just it's just basically. I think what's lost these days in comics, especially comic book coloring and just the art, is just a lack of fundamentals, because they're not using professional commercial artists anymore. They're hiring cheap foreign labor that is using 3D and all these crutches, and everything looks so canned. None of it has any vitality, any dynamism. It doesn't jump off the page and grab you by the throat. It's just sitting there. and there's nothing a color. I mean, I have polished a lot of turds over the years as a colorist. Okay. And I'm not going to name names, obviously. The artists that I named that I worked with are certainly not the people that I was polishing turds with. I mean, you don't polish. Frank Cho doesn't produce turds. Okay. But there have been a lot of crappy artists I've worked with at Marvel and DC. Sometimes you have to work with crappy artists in order to get to the point where you're working with Nicola Scott or Jesus Marino or whomever. But I think sometimes bad art is just bad art, and there's not much you can do about other than just kind of do your best and turn it in and move on and never show it to anybody.
But you can't use like poser models in art because it has no give. It has no, stretch to it. Sometimes in order to emphasize the action in a panel, you have to be able to exaggerate the anatomy so you can make the point that the panel is trying to make. You don't want mechanically correct animated puppets.
Well, and also you can kind of cheat sometimes with different camera lenses with some of these things. I do know that, if you're using wider angle lenses, you can sort of exaggerate perspective and give the depth of field and that forced perspective. You can kind of pull a little bit more out of it. But I'm working on a children's book, and I'm working with Butch Geis. And I don't think anybody does forced perspective. Very few do forced perspective and have as good an eye for composition than Butch. I've been lucky. Paul Ravoche is an amazing artist. I mean, you want to talk about talented, and his layouts are just so good. When we did Agent Poso, I shouldn't say that because I'm not supposed to, but I'll move on.
It's okay.
Somebody worked under a pen name on that book. I won't mention it again, but Sergio's another guy who's just amazing at forced perspective, and he's a student of the Kubert School. He went and learned the fundamentals from one of the masters, from Joe and from some of the instructors there at that school. So nothing substitutes education, and practice and just grinding it out until you've developed the tools and the methods to be able to maximize your talents and take them to a whole nother level. And there's no computer program, there's nothing that can substitute for that kind of stuff. And I think that's what we're seeing lacking in modern comic book art. You certainly don't see it in the indies, whether it's Cyberfrog or whether it's Joe Frankenstein or anything stuff stuff that I was looking at some of the stuff Aaron Lepresti's doing these days. These guys are so good, but they're old. They're like almost like old masters at this point. Those are skills that those guys cultivated over the years because there was no digital back then. There was no crutch. There was no Google Earth. You couldn't go and I love Sarah Pacelli, but she uses Google Earth. She uses Poser. She uses stuff. She uses, it looks canned. And she's probably one of the better examples that I can point to who uses some of those things. But some of the stuff today that comes out in Marvel and DC, I mean, if you showed that at a con to an editor back in the day, back in the 90s, early 2000s, you basically be told you're not ready yet. Go away, get better, come back and see me next year.
Wow. It's like the comic book equivalent of the actors in front of a green screen.
I think you're right, man. I think that's a great point. I think that, like we were talking about, so much is dependent on technology, and we need to get back to the human element, and this AI stuff, man. I mean, it bugs me. It troubles me. because they're, that AI is pulling it from somewhere, from some artist, from some photograph. None of that is real. None of it's, I don't know I don't know everything that goes into AI, but when I look at the stuff that I see online, I can clearly see that it's not authentic. There's no human element to it, and I think that is that's part of what makes great art. It certainly is when you look at the old masters. Whether
But
it's Raphael or Michelangelo or
you just gave me a great idea, though, man. I'm gonna start eating your guys' lunch. I'm just gonna have AI prompts, and I'm gonna remind the prompt. Okay, now give me a panel. Give me a comics panel, as if it were written by Chuck Dixon, drawn by so and so, and colored by Brett
There
Smith.
you
Like,
go.
give me that panel,
We
and
should
we'll see
try
what it
that.
comes up with.
We should try that. I'd love to see
I would.
what it comes up with.
I would do that right now. I wish I had prepared the thought of that ahead of time.
It's going to be the
See-
equivalent of Will Smith eating spaghetti.
Well, I've already said this online, and so I will say it again. What AI art right now has a great use case for is quickly popping up pictures of things that nobody would pay an artist to make. Like,
Yeah.
you get an idea and say, hey, what if the Transformers, and it's always Star Wars, what if the Transformers were Star Wars? And so
Right.
Optimus Prime becomes Luke Skywalker and Megatron becomes Darth Vader, but they're
Right.
Transformers. Okay, and that's a cute idea, and you get about 20 pictures and you post them on Twitter and everybody looks at them because they're actually neat. Or a real one I saw is Jodorowsky's Tron.
Yeah.
So it's Tron
Right.
as if, I mean, that's a real one. They had an actual
I saw
article about it.
He-Man as an 80s sitcom. There are some
Yeah.
ones that are really funny and they're really interesting. And I'm not saying that there's no space for that kind of stuff, but let's face it, this is not real stuff.
Nobody could pay for that because the rights are too tangled, and they're just interesting, cool things to post on Reddit or Twitter or Facebook or whatever.
Right.
But
it's disposable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All of these things look the same.
They do.
You look
the style,
at
the rendering, the giant forehead line. There's some really wacky. I'm sure this stuff will get refined more and it'll get more dialed in and it'll get more authentic looking, but it's not authentic looking. It really has an AI. It really does have a canned sort of look. Even AI has kind of a canned look. It has to. It doesn't have anything. It doesn't have a soul. It doesn't have heart. It doesn't have soul. It can't draw from the human condition. I mean, when I get a black and white page, it's my interpretation, and that comes from my heart and it comes from my soul, and those feelings that I want to evoke out of that cover are funneled through my brain, which then implements all of the fundamentals of art and design that I've learned over the last 28 years. And one of the things I was thinking about starting was doing some videos where I go back and I pull a page. And I was thinking about doing this with some Booster Gold that I worked on with Dan Jurgens like about 20 years ago, and going back and refining it and making it better, because I have learned so much over the last 20 years, and I'm a much better colorist. I'm much more efficient. I understand it so much better, and that just comes from experience, man. And there's no amount of AI, that can do that. And I think that as an artist, I think you should get better over time. It's like I worked with Ethan back in the early 2000s on some stuff he was doing called Weapon X, and it was great stuff. But if you compare it to Ethan's work today, he certainly wouldn't want to talk about it. He wants to talk about what he's working on today, because that's his best work, and it shows. It's not that work was bad. It's like somebody who's lost weight, and you say, gosh, you look great, and then that somehow implies that you looked like shit before. It's like, no, it's, you just, as an artist, you improve over time, you get better. It's not about, it's not black or white. It's not that the old stuff sucks. It's not like the stuff that I did for Devil's Due at G.I. Joe was bad. But would I color that way today? Would I make those same decisions today? No, no, things are different now, and I've grown as an artist. I've grown as a person, and so all of that stuff, your experiences, the movies you watch, the books you read, the comics, the TV. I mean, everything. Your life experiences, all that stuff goes into your artwork, whether you know it or not. And sometimes I look at stuff years later, and I'm like, oh God, I pulled that from this movie, or I pulled that from RoboCop, or I pulled that from Basic Instinct, and I didn't even know it at the time. But I'm like, holy shit! Like it just came out that way, and I didn't even know it. But I see those things, and but I thought I'm doing some tutorials, like some coloring demos, where I literally take old pages and go in, do a screen recording, and just kind of give them a little facelift and show how I've grown as an artist, what I would do differently now, what's right about this page, what I got right, what I got wrong, how do we fix it, how do we plus it, how do we make it better, and then therefore you show growth as an artist and as a human, and that is something that AI, it just doesn't have, because it doesn't have a soul.
Yeah,
Amen.
it's time. Isn't it time?
It didn't feel like an hour and 43 minutes, but that's when you're having a good time.
It has been great. It has been great. I will open it up. DW, last chance at a question.
Yeah, if you guys got anything, I will shut up and answer questions if you guys get anything else, but because I probably talk too much.
Not at all.
No, I just wanted to mention two things. One, I was in on the Kickstarter for the John Ringo Zombie series book, and I really enjoyed that. So
awesome, man. Yeah, that's great. That's great to hear. That was a fun project. That was a lot of fun. We had a good time on that.
And I also wanted to give you a chance to talk about your upcoming project as much as you wanted. Has that already? Are you going to be doing that on Kickstarter, or has that already gone through? Or
Matt, you talking about Mad Dogs?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're still trying to figure that one out. Mad Dogs is a 3-issue series that Chuck was a French publisher reached out to Chuck back in like the late '80s, and they said, we want kind of a buddy cop action book, and we want 3 issues, and do what you want, just go away and give us buddy action cop genre. So he did kind of this kind of Dirty Harry meets the Dirty Dozen. Instead of just one Dirty Harry, you've got 5 of them, and they're just sort of turned loose on the streets of Philadelphia, where Chuck grew up. So a lot of it's sort of autobiographical, as far as some of the stories and the scenarios that are in it, including the scene where the guy drops the guy off the roof. That's for real.
Oh, wow.
And he turns this in to these French publishers, and they were appalled. They were absolutely disgusted, and they just said, "This is abhorrent. It's just grotesque. It's violent, and just we will never publish this." However, it was all paid for, and it was done, and it was ready to go. So he owns the rights, and it's got beautiful artwork. Unfortunately, the artist has passed. Victor Topi. He was a Brazilian artist, and you can, it's very indicative of kind of that black and white sort of sketchy style of that era. Sort of even the Marvel bullpen at the time sort of had that kind of Mark Texeira, kind of scratchy, kind of rough look, very graphic. And it was always meant to be sort of black and white, so that's why it's such heavy inks. But it's beautiful art. And so anyway, French publisher wouldn't touch it, so he published it through Eclipse Comics in like 1991. Very small publisher, and not many people read it. Had a tiny print run. You can still find it on eBay here and there. You can buy all 3 issues. And I remember reading a review of it, and I emailed Chuck and I said, "What's the deal with this? Like, who's got the rights to this?" And he said, "I do." And they got all the artwork. He's got all the original artwork, which was, and he said, I've got it all scanned. And I was like, we should color this and reissue it. So, because, when I look at it, it's beautiful art, but it can be made so much better with some color, and some lighting. And so I figured, I'll do a real kind of light touch on it. I won't go super detailed. I'm just going to add some lighting and some atmospherics and then I also gave it kind of a softer sort of rendering, almost kind of like markers, because I wanted to sort of make it more organic to kind of match the art, which is very, very organic and sort of raw because it's all drawn on a drawing table, with traditional mediums. So I didn't want it to look too slick and digital. So I just asked them, I said, why don't I color this? I'll do it in my off time. And then once I'm done, we'll crowdfund it, and it'll be all done. It'll be all packaged, and we'll just run a 30-day campaign. And, what a better way to get people to part with $25 than to know that it's done, right? And then they're going to get it in 30 days. So that's kind of the plan. And then we decided to fold it into the Spin Rack, which is what Chuck and Graham have launched, which is an online, it's a website which is also going to provide online comics, NFTs, video games, all based around Chuck and Graham's IPs, whether it's Joe Frankenstein or Winter World. This is sort of their baby that they're producing with some investors as a way to go around the crowdfunding and just do comics direct to market. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to do. It's still sort of up in the air. Either way, I think that we would have a successful crowdfunding, because the whole idea was to have 3 issues in the can. And then, we started talking, why don't we do an extra issue? Why don't we continue this series on? Because the ending of the 3rd issue is completely open-ended. And that's what's so great about it, is that you can, even though some of the main characters do get killed, one does, you can keep the story going. But it's the other thing I loved about it was a period piece. And I think that you can get away with much more these days when you do period pieces, because you're not subject to all the woke SJW crap that people expect. It's like, if you're going to tell a story about the 80s, that stuff didn't exist back then. So you can work right through it. There's no problem there. But, basically, I've just been kind of chipping away at it slowly. And some of the other stuff that I've been doing has sort of been getting in the way, because, that stuff has deadlines, and Mad Dogs is just sort of something I was just sort of doing as a labor of love and also in my off time. But still intend to get it done by the end of the year, the full 3 issues. And we're either going to publish it through Spin Rack direct, or we'll crowdfund it. But either way, I really want to, what I was thinking about doing was building in some kind of a stretch goal for that 4th issue. And, if we can meet and exceed that stretch goal, we'll go out and hire someone to, because Chuck's already got a story. He's already got a 4th issue mapped out in his mind. And I think he's already started to kind of write it here and there. But, and I've got an artist, this guy, Kevin West, who I was thinking about approaching to draw it, because he's got an organic style. It's not digital. And it's kind of similar to Victor's work. It's got, I don't want to say it's dated, but maybe I should, because that's kind of a compliment these days. This new stuff sucks so much that, those old guys, some of these older guys that have sort of this dated look, look so fresh and crisp and engaging in comparison to, to this new stuff. It's the same with Butch. This children's book that I'm doing with him is a 8.5 by 9 format. And when I had the conversation with him the other day, he's been turning in roughs. And I just said, are you working digital or are you working traditional? He's like, nope. He's like, I'm old school, man. Everything's on a drawing table. Everything's, pencil and eraser. And I was just like, that's great. That's great. Because that has such a fresh feel. It's something that we've forgotten. We're so used to all the digital stuff that when you get that organic stuff, it really, really stands out. The same way I think that practical effects stand out more than digital. Something else about practical effects is that they're about half the cost of digital. It's a lot cheaper to do special makeup effects and old school in-camera effects rather than the digital stuff. Hollywood could be slashing budgets by going back to practical effects. But I think that even within print, I think that too much is digital. I see too much just, especially in the children's book series. It's all this really weird digital artwork, and it has no soul. It doesn't have any real feeling to it. So Landing Butch was a score. I mean, that guy is just, God, he is just a monster artist, absolute beast. He's inked all of the great people, all the great artists, Brian Hitch and all these guys. And so again, that bleeds off into his own work, which is that's just how it works. That's how it goes. But yeah, between Mad Dogs and this children's book series, once I start getting some finished artwork and whatnot, I'll probably break loose some more details. But the idea that I had is so good and it's so obvious that I don't want to talk about it until I'm kind of more in the position to say, we're close to, and I've already got some publishers interested, so it's not like it's not going to get published, because it will. But it's such an obvious idea that I don't want to talk about the details too much. But I've got it's written by my girlfriend Lisa DePasquale, edited by Chuck Dixon, artwork by Butch Geis, and obviously I'll be coloring it. But the overall kind of concept for the series, it was mine, and it's going to be aimed at early readers, 6 to 9.
Cool.
Yeah.
If I could say this as a piece of advice for indie comics makers, if you're an artist or a colorist, either pair up with a writer or spend time learning how to write well. That's even big name artists, when they jump ship and found their own companies and stuff, it turns out that they are really great at designing characters and really great at making awesome art, but the stories they put together with it are very often not really compelling or interesting stories, and they don't really develop well. And I'm thinking of so many books that I loved the art of, and the ideas for were great concepts from the 90s. And it may not necessarily be who you think I am, but because I probably didn't read those Jack comics, but they probably fall into that too.
Yeah, it's kind of, we're talking about Tom Cruise. It's sort of like, it's Tom Cruise is one of a kind, and these guys who can write really well as they draw, they're rare. They're just really rare. It's not often that an artist can go and write as well as they draw if they were, working with a Chuck Dixon or a Mark Millar. It's again, you kind of got to know your limitations, and I've always known mine. And I just, and this is my 7th or 8th project with Chuck. And we have such a shorthand together, way of communicating, and on top of that, I just, he's one of the best. I mean, to me, he is the John Milius of comics. He writes for men, and he's got more John's got more published scripts than anyone in Hollywood, or more scripts adapted to film than anyone in Hollywood. And Chuck has more scripts published than anyone in comics, even Stan Lee. I mean, these guys they're just legends. And, Chuck and I see eye to eye on probably nearly everything anyway. And like I said, we just have just a great communication and just a great relationship. And it's been a blessing, because I grew up reading that guy and just loving him on Punisher and Alien Legion and Batman, obviously, and so many others. And to, be a 10 or 11-year-old kid reading that stuff, and then later, become an adult and get to hire him. It's just a dream come true, even though it was never a dream that I really ever had. It's beyond my wildest dreams. So, I mean, originally I just hoped to work in the comic book industry, and be able to make a living at it and do well. You know, I never figured that it would turn into producing my own books and going out and hiring creatives that I grew up admiring and being inspired by and reading. And that's sort of been the biggest, one of the biggest blessings in my life, and really an arc in my story that I never saw coming. You know, but you know, when you're on a roll, you don't mess with don't mess with the streaks like Crash Davis and Bull Durham. You never fuck with a winning streak. So Chuck and I are doing, you know, that's a streak, and I just hope that streak keeps going, because we have continued to make really good books, whether it's Black Tide Rising, Blood graphic novel is one that we did together, which pretty much nobody saw because it was never promoted. It's on Amazon though. It's a 98-page graphic novel. It's a werewolf western, werewolf period piece, kind of like The Witch. And Clinton Cash. I mean, God, we've done a bunch of stuff together, a lot of fun stuff, and it's just been an absolute pleasure and a blessing. So I'm really grateful.
That's great. And for one, I'm grateful that you came on to share us with all that stuff, because it's been absolutely uh, fascinating and frankly exciting to hear your story and all that. And geeking out on movies was great too. But I think
I can do that for another hour. That's for sure. You know, geeking out on movies, man. Right. You know, really any kind of pop culture. I mean, it's one of those things where it's just it's my passion. You know, and I was lucky to kind of be able to blur those lines between work and play, because that just doesn't happen all that often. You know, most people hate their job, and that's unfortunate. But that's why it's work. You know, and there's nothing wrong with that. Work is work. But I've been really, really blessed, to have had the career that I've had, and to be able to work with people that I have. And it's I don't take it for granted. It's something that I thank God for, every day. But yeah, it's my pleasure, it's my honor. I was happy to be here. We can do it again, because there's always more fun comics and movies and things to talk about. That's for sure.
well, that's great. Yeah, and we'll stay in touch. At least stay in touch with us,
You bet.
and because we'd love to hear about what happens next.
Yeah, once I get a little bit closer on this children's book thing, I'll definitely come back, and we'll take a look at some artwork, and and I'll keep you guys posted on Mad Dog. So you saw the pages that I sent. What did you think?
What struck me the most, and this is what I like the most about it, is, and now, honestly, I just went back and re-looked at them while you were describing how your organic coloring was interacting with the art by Mr. Tappy.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh yeah, that was the vibe I was getting. Let me go look at that again and see how that worked.
Good. I'm glad it works.
I came of an age where I was born in the 70s and, became a teenager in the 80s. And so I saw a lot of these movies when I was a kid, but they were like the Death Wish movies and all those other movies of that whole crime genre where the city is going to pot. And because that's what was really happening in the 70s and early 80s and stuff. And so
film was a real reflection. The Seven Ups, the French Connection, Death Wish, Dirty Harry. These were all reflections of society and what was going on at the time. Absolutely.
And I was reading, when I was looking at the pages you sent, I was like, oh, this is and part of it was like half subliminal until I got through like three or four of the pages, and I was like, this is exactly like Death Wish. This is exactly like all of those urban dystopian movies. And I was like, that's awesome, because I love those movies. I loved, the citizens were taking up arms to defend their communities, because the courts and upper police stuff, they weren't doing it. And
DAs,
it was so compelling. Chuck's writing was stark. It grabbed you right from the beginning, and the art was working right with it, because just the lines and the colors, it told you, right? When he's sitting there watching the TV or in the room with the TV, the way that the lines were like really jagged, right?
Yeah.
On his the side of his body, just told you that this was a dirty, grimy city. You didn't have to see like mounds of garbage in the street or people getting shot. Just that subtle stuff
Mm-hmm.
told you this was a dark city. This was a city that was, this is a milieu that was really dark. And I was just like, it dragged you right in.
Good. It's
And
I think it's immersive, and I think it's definitely hard boiled, definitely. But I think I thought that since we're kind of going through that again in these blue cities and blue states, I think that and these DAs seem to be more concerned with the rights of the perps rather than the rights of the victims. I think that from a standpoint of genre and messaging and just overall kind of scope, I think that it rings true today. I think that there's a connection there again, and that's another reason why I approached Chuck to kind of revive this old series and give it a fresh new look with some color and tell this story. Who doesn't love a period piece, for one? And also, those buddy action genre, those buddy cop genre, they're westerns in disguise. I mean, basically, you've got a town that is falling apart at the seams because of crime, and so the lone hero has to come in and save the town. And then once the town is saved and fixed, they no longer need him. So he leaves. It's kind of like Shane, I mean, off into the sunset he goes, and that's basically what Dirty Harry, I think, in Death Wish, those movies are very much westerns, but also they are social commentary in a lot of ways on, and that Dirty Harry's got that great scene with the DA where he's all talking about the rights of Scorpio. That man has rights, and Clint's like, well, what about that girl that he murdered and dropped down into the storm drain? What about her rights? That's the same kind. That's the thing that grinds me today, is that there's all this. The perp is the victim, and the cop is the perp. I mean, that's how it's kind of treated. So I just kind of figured this storyline and this theme will play again today because we're right in the middle of it again.
It's timely all over again.
That's kind of why I figured it would work. I wouldn't be spending my time on this book. There's a lot of other things to do, obviously, but I wouldn't be spending my time on it if I didn't think that it was a story worth telling. Obviously, it's beautiful artwork. Obviously, it's Chuck Dixon. But I think that there's something, like you said, it's timely. And I think that from that standpoint, it will connect with readers, and like I said, most people never saw the book, sadly. And you can buy it on eBay, but I'm going to give everyone extra incentive to check it out, the new version, because I think the colors, really bring it to life. And I think Victor, would who tragically died, I think, of cancer in the early 2000s. I think he'd love what I'm doing with his artwork, because I'm trying not to step on it. A lot of colorists these days really over render things, and they just step all over the art. One of the things I learned when working with Walt Simonson on Avengers was to first I looked at what Laura Martin had done with them and some other past digital colorists, but a lot of the times less is more. Let the artwork breathe. Don't stifle it. Go in and just complement it, with warms and cools and textures. And if you'll notice in some of those pages, a lot of the times I add smoke and atmospherics and stuff like that. And again, that's kind of to give it sort of a 80s kind of cinematography sort of look, but at the same time, you're also building depth and giving it, more of a cinematic look and sort of feel. So it's fun stuff to work on too. I mean, that stuff is sort of labor of love, But yeah, I'm glad that you had a positive reaction to it because you start on these things sometimes and you love it so much you think that everybody's going to love it, and that's not always the case. It doesn't always work out that way. So
Outstanding. It's true.
if you want to share
Um,
that with if you want to share that with them, go ahead. If you want to take a look at it as well, so both, I'd love to get both you guys' response to it. So
yeah, sure.
yeah,
I'd love to
forward
see
that
it.
along.
yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Let's wrap up for now. It's been totally great. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today.
Appreciate it.
I hope everybody. We had a few people hanging out live. You didn't get any questions from the chat, but I hope they enjoyed the talk today, and I hope everybody listening later really appreciates it and goes and checks out some of your stuff. I just, and I didn't say this up front, like I'm not a comics guy.
Mhm.
I mentioned Watchmen. I haven't read much more than that, but so it's been, from my perspective, it's been really interesting and fascinating to
That's
talk about
cool.
all of this stuff.
So I love talking to people who aren't comics people. Movie people are easy to convert to comics. That is definitely been my experience. I mean, visual storytelling is visual storytelling, whether it's 24 frames per second or one frame, six frames, 6 to 8 frames per page. It's the same kind of thing.
Although I will say, I sorry to take up more time, but I did get as a gift a few years ago a copy of My Hero Macadamia Wall Might.
That was fun.
You've got a credit on some of that, so that's
Yeah,
cool.
I think I colored. I think maybe half the book or something like that. But yeah, the political satire is always fun, and I think that's the only way that you can really do politics in comics is if it's satirical and it's got an element of fun and kind of silliness. Otherwise, I don't like politics in comics. The message, as my buddy Robert Davi, who I've interviewed on Political Punks, who's probably one of the greatest Bond villains of all time, is Franz Sanchez. He says that the message has to be in the ravioli. You can't shoehorn this stuff in, and just lecture people. It's got to be baked into the story or baked into the ravioli, and I believe that, especially when it comes to politics and comics.
Well said. Well said. Daddy Warpig, we're going to give you the last words. Can you send us off?
Absolutely. We want to thank everyone who came to the show and listened live, and we also want to thank everybody who will listen later. This has been Geek Gab for Saturday, April 1st, 2023. You can get us here just about every week on youtube.com/geekgab. That is youtube.com/geekgab. Don't forget to subscribe and click the little bell icon to be notified when we go live, so you can come and listen to us interview great guests like this, or just do reviews and general kibitzing. How do you like that, John? Kibitzing.
I love the word kibitzing.
We are signing out for today, folks. Oh yeah, we're available on the Google Play Store, the Apple iTunes Store, and on SoundCloud.com. You can download us on the device of your choice, or just listen to us on the web, because that's the kind of cool, laid-back guys we are. We are signing out for today, but don't you worry, don't you fret. We will be back.